The first sign that something was wrong came through the morning fog. American soldiers had been trained to expect patterns in the Pacific War. Rifles cracked from tree lines, mortars thudded from hidden positions. Sometimes there were banzai charges, reckless, loud, desperate. But what emerged from the mist that morning didn't fit any of those categories. They weren't shouting, they were running. A line of figures moved forward in eerie silence, their boots striking wet ground in near-perfect rhythm. At first, the soldiers watching through rifle scopes assumed they were hallucinating. The shapes were wrong, too upright, too deliberate. Then the fog thinned just enough for steel to catch the light. Swords, not bayonets fixed to rifles, actual swords, held low and steady, blades angled forward as if guided by invisible hands. The men carrying them wore standard Japanese uniforms, helmets strapped tight, packs secured. But the weapons in their hands belonged to another century. For a moment, no one fired. The hesitation lasted seconds, long enough for disbelief to harden into fear. This was 1944. Machine guns were dug in. Artillery was zeroed. Air support had softened the area the day before. No sane commander would send troops charging modern defensive lines with blades. Yet here they were, advancing with measured speed, weaving between shell craters, using smoke and terrain with unnerving discipline. When the firing finally started, the sound was deafening. Machine guns ripped open the fog, cutting down the front ranks. Bodies fell, twisted, vanished into the churned mud. But the line didn't collapse. It compressed. The men behind stepped forward instantly, filling the gaps as if the losses had been anticipated, calculated. That was when the shouting began. Not wild screaming, but sharp, controlled commands. The charge accelerated. Within seconds, the distance that should have been lethal became dangerously close. Grenades were thrown, rifles were emptied. Still, some of the figures made it through, slipping into trenches, vaulting sandbags, blades flashing in the half-light. What followed wasn't a battle in the modern sense. It was chaos, close, intimate, terrifying. Soldiers who survived would later struggle to explain it. Not just the violence, wars had plenty of that, but the feeling that they had stepped into the wrong war entirely, like history had folded in on itself. When it was over, the field was silent again. Smoke drifted over bodies scattered at impossible angles. Rifles lay beside swords. Helmets rested in the mud, split cleanly in two. Medics moved carefully, unsure of what they might still face. The official report would later classify the attack as another failed Japanese assault. Another example of fanaticism. Another statistic in a brutal campaign. But among the men who witnessed it, that explanation never quite worked. Because this hadn't been reckless. It had been precise. Every movement suggested training, formation, timing. The swords weren't symbolic. They were integral, used to deflect bayonets, hook rifles, finish fights when ammunition ran dry. This wasn't a desperate last stand. It was a doctrine being tested under fire. And that raised a far more disturbing question. If this wasn't madness, then it was planning. Somewhere behind the front lines, someone had decided that ancient steel still belonged on modern battlefields. Someone had trained these men to believe that closing the distance mattered more than surviving it. Someone had prepared them for a role most armies had abandoned centuries earlier. The soldiers on that battlefield would never learn the full truth. They were rotated out, shipped home, or killed in later fighting. Their stories scattered into fragments, half-remembered, often dismissed. But what they had stumbled into that morning was real, a unit shaped by an idea most of the world thought extinct. And this charge, the one that shouldn't have existed, was only the beginning. Because it wasn't the last time Japan would unleash warriors armed with both rifles and blades. It was the first glimpse of a secret experiment the war was about to consume. The decision didn't begin on a battlefield. It began in quiet rooms, far from gunfire, where Japan's military leadership stared at maps that kept getting smaller. Island after island was falling. Air superiority was slipping away. American factories were producing planes and tanks faster than Japan could destroy them. By every modern metric, the war was turning against them, and that terrified them, not just because of defeat, but because of what defeat would mean. Japan's officers had been raised on the idea that war was not only about firepower, but about spirit, courage, will, the belief that a soldier's resolve could outweigh material disadvantage. Yet now, the war had become mechanical, industrial, impersonal. To some within the high command, this wasn't just a strategic problem, it was a moral one. They believed Japan was losing something older than territory, the warrior identity that had once defined it, the very thing that had allowed smaller forces to dominate stronger enemies in the past. Modern rifles and artillery were necessary, yes, but they were also corrupting. They created distance. They allowed fear to hide behind technology. And distance, they argued, weakened the soul. This idea was not universally accepted. Many officers dismissed it as nostalgia, dangerous romanticism in the middle of an industrial war. But others saw opportunity. If Japan could not outproduce its enemies, perhaps it could outfight them in ways they did not expect. Shock could become a weapon. Fear could become force multiplication. So the conversation shifted. Not toward abandoning modern weapons, that would have been suicide, but towards something more radical. What if the old and the new were combined? What if Japan didn't return to the samurai, but re-engineered them? The philosophy of Bushido, once a personal code of honor, was stripped down and repurposed. Loyalty became absolute obedience. Fearlessness became expendability. Death in service of the emperor became not a tragedy, but proof of worth. This wasn't about tradition for tradition's sake, it was about psychology, both of their own soldiers and of the enemy. Western armies, they believed, relied on predictability, fire superiority, defensive depth. But what happened when an enemy ignored those assumptions entirely? What happened when soldiers advanced without hesitation, closed distance relentlessly, and fought face to face even when logic said they shouldn't? The answer, they believed, was hesitation, confusion, a momentary collapse in certainty. That moment, even seconds long, could be exploited. Still, belief wasn't enough. Turning philosophy into battlefield reality required approval at the highest levels, quiet approvals, off-the-record authorizations, programs that didn't appear in official communiques or press releases. Because this idea was controversial. If it failed, it would be an embarrassment. Worse, proof that Japan had surrendered to myth instead of adapting to modern war. So it was buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. Officially, nothing new was happening. Unofficially, instructors were being reassigned, training grounds were being repurposed, budgets were being redirected. And then came the most critical question of all. Who could actually do this? Not every soldier could be turned into a weapon like this. It required discipline beyond standard training. Men who wouldn't panic under machine gun fire, who could move forward when instinct screamed to stop, who would accept that survival was secondary to execution. Finding them would take time. Training them would take something else entirely. because believing in the samurai spirit was one thing. Forcing it back into human bodies under modern war conditions was something far more dangerous, and that danger was just beginning to take shape. In the next phase, Japan would discover that creating such soldiers wasn't about teaching them how to fight. It was about teaching them how to stop fearing death. The men were never told what they were being prepared for. They arrived at remote training grounds in small groups, transported under vague orders, their destinations absent from official paperwork. Some believed they had been selected for special assault units. Others assumed punishment. None of them were informed that they were part of an experiment, one that would push the limits of what a human body and mind could endure. From the first day, it was clear this was not ordinary training. There were no speeches, no explanations, just orders, precise, relentless, and absolute. Training began before dawn and ended long after dark. Sleep was treated as a luxury. Food was rationed deliberately, not to starve them, but to keep them permanently uncomfortable. Fatigue, instructors believed, revealed character faster than any exam. The first phase focused on control. Sword training was introduced immediately, but not as ceremonial practice. These were not polished kata or graceful demonstrations. Recruits were drilled in brutally practical techniques: how to close distance, how to strike through resistance, how to keep moving even when wounded. Blades were real. So were the injuries. Blood on the training ground was not unusual, and pauses for medical care were rare. Firearms were never removed from the equation. Rifles, pistols, and grenades were integrated into every exercise. Recruits were forced to switch between weapons under stress, firing until empty, then drawing blades without breaking stride. Bayonet drills blurred into sword combat until the distinction no longer mattered. The goal was to erase hesitation, to make transition instinctive. Then the training escalated. Live fire exercises were conducted while recruits advanced toward active firing lines. Machine guns fired overhead, sometimes intentionally too low. Instructors watched closely, not for skill, but for fear. Any sign of panic, any hesitation, resulted in immediate removal. Those men were sent away, their names erased from the program. Others weren't sent away. Some collapsed from exhaustion and never returned to formation. Heat stroke, infections, accidents that were quietly logged as training losses. There were no ceremonies, no acknowledgement. Their absence became part of the lesson. Psychological conditioning ran alongside physical punishment. Recruits were told repeatedly that fear was a Western weakness, that distance was cowardice, that modern war had diluted honor. They were taught that closing with the enemy restored balance, that death in motion was preferable to survival in retreat. Night drills were the worst. Men were woken without warning and forced into mock assaults through jungle terrain, trenches, and narrow corridors. Loudspeakers blasted gunfire and screams. Explosives detonated nearby, close enough to rattle teeth and rupture eardrums. Sleep deprivation blurred reality until commands felt like instinct rather than instruction. Not everyone made it. By the end of training, the battalion was smaller than planned, but those who remained were different. They moved together without speaking. They advanced automatically when ordered, regardless of terrain or opposition. Pain became background noise. Fear became something to be acknowledged and ignored. And yet, even among the instructors, doubt began to surface. Training was controlled, predictable. War was neither. The men had been forged into weapons, but no one could say with certainty whether those weapons would shatter on first contact with a real enemy. No simulation could fully replicate the chaos of battle, the randomness of artillery, the cruelty of machine guns, the panic that spread when plans collapsed. That question hung over the camp as orders finally arrived. The battalion was being deployed. There were no speeches, no farewells, just equipment issued, blades sharpened, rifles checked one final time. The men assembled in silence, packs heavy, faces unreadable. They were ready, or as ready as anyone could be. Now came the moment the program had been built for. The battlefield would decide whether Japan had resurrected an ancient weapon or created a deadly illusion. The battalion's first real test came at night, not by accident, but by design. Japanese commanders understood exactly what they were risking. In daylight, modern warfare belonged to firepower. Machine guns ruled open ground. Artillery dominated movement. Any unit advancing with blades would be slaughtered before it ever closed the distance. So they chose darkness. The battalion was deployed into dense jungle terrain where visibility collapsed to a few meters. Rain muted sound. Thick vegetation broke up formations. Radios were unreliable. For once, the battlefield favored proximity over range. The first assault began without warning. Allied outposts reported strange movement just beyond the tree line, shapes that didn't retreat when flares went up. When machine guns opened fire, the response was not a counter-barrage, but motion. The battalion advanced through fire, using terrain to absorb bullets, slipping into blind spots, crawling when necessary, running when possible. By the time defenders realized how close the attackers were, it was already too late. The fighting that followed defied every training manual. Rifles were grabbed and wrenched away, bayonets met blades, trenches became killing pits where gunfire was useless and instinct took over. Soldiers later described the attackers as unnervingly calm, not screaming, not charging blindly, but moving with intent. For brief moments, the doctrine worked. Outposts were overrun faster than expected. Defensive lines collapsed under the shock of close-quarters fighting. Units trained for ranged engagement found themselves face-to-face with an enemy that refused to give them distance. Reports began filtering back up the chain of command. Some officers were impressed, others were alarmed, because the success came at a cost that could not be ignored. Even under ideal conditions, casualties were severe. Machine guns still found their marks. Grenades still tore through advancing formations. For every position taken, bodies were left behind. Too many to justify the gains. Worse still, the element of surprise faded quickly. Allied units adapted. Flares were used more aggressively. Defensive perimeters tightened. Automatic weapons were repositioned for overlapping fields of fire. Once the battalion lost darkness and confusion as allies, the balance shifted brutally. In one engagement, an entire platoon was cut down before reaching enemy lines. The ground was so thoroughly covered by fire that no sword ever touched its target. The doctrine that promised dominance through proximity met the unyielding reality of modern killing efficiency. And yet, the program was not abandoned. Instead, it was refined. Commanders learned where the battalion could be used and where it could not. Open ground was avoided. Daylight assaults were minimized. The unit was reassigned to the most dangerous roles: clearing bunkers, storming fortified jungle positions, attacking when others hesitated. Success was measured not in survival, but in impact. Did the attack break the line? Did it delay the enemy? Did it force redeployment? If the answer was yes, the losses were considered acceptable. This shift marked a turning point. The battalion was no longer an experiment to be evaluated. It was a tool, one that could be deployed when conventional units were too slow, too cautious, or too valuable to risk. A weapon designed for moments when hesitation was unacceptable and casualties were inevitable. Among the soldiers themselves, understanding set in. They were not being used because they were expected to win cleanly. They were being used because they were expected to die moving forward. Orders came faster now. Missions grew shorter and more violent. There was no illusion of long-term survival, only execution. The swords were sharpened constantly, not for ceremony, for inevitability. And as the war pressed on, the battalion's role grew darker still, shifting from shock unit to something far more grim. Because once an army accepts death as a tactic, it rarely stops there. By the time the battalion understood its true purpose, it was already too late to refuse it. They were no longer deployed as an alternative. They were deployed as a solution, the kind used when commanders had run out of options and time. When terrain was too fortified, resistance too stubborn, or the political cost of delay too high, the missions changed. They were sent first, not because they were strongest, but because they were expendable. Assaults that would have been delayed or softened by artillery were instead handed to the battalion. Orders were simple, almost brutal in their honesty. Advance, break the position, hold as long as possible. Extraction was rarely mentioned. The language surrounding their deployments shifted as well. Losses were no longer described as casualties. They were described as offerings, proof of loyalty, fulfillment of duty. Bushido, once a personal moral code, had been hollowed out and repurposed into justification. The soldiers felt the difference immediately. There was less planning now, fewer contingencies. Missions were rushed. When questions were raised, they were ignored. The battalion's role was not to survive long enough to learn. It was to die long enough to matter. Some began to realize that the swords were no longer weapons of shock. They were symbols, symbols meant to terrify the enemy and harden Japan's resolve. Symbols meant to be seen, photographed, remembered. The battalion's presence was meant to communicate something darker than tactical intent, a message that Japan would continue fighting even when logic said the war was lost. In some operations, the battalion was ordered to attack positions that could not be taken. Machine gun nests with clear fields of fire, fortifications that artillery had already failed to crack. The result was predictable. Men advanced, men fell. Few reached the enemy. Survivors reported an unsettling calm before these assaults. No speeches, no last-minute promises of victory, just quiet preparation. Blades were cleaned, rifles checked, letters written and handed off without ceremony. Some men burned personal items rather than risk them being captured. They knew. Commanders did too. But the logic of the war had shifted. Every day the conflict continued, drained resources Japan no longer had. If a battalion could buy time with blood, then blood became currency. This was the final transformation. The battalion was no longer fighting the enemy. It was fighting time, and time was winning. As losses mounted, replacements became harder to find. Training programs were shortened. Standards slipped. The original cohesion, the silent discipline that had defined the unit, began to fracture under constant attrition. What remained was still dangerous, but increasingly desperate. Some assaults succeeded only because defenders broke psychologically, shaken by attackers who advanced without regard for survival. Other assaults ended in annihilation. The battalion erased down to handfuls of men. Through it all, the narrative persisted. These were warriors. These were heroes. But among the survivors, a harsher truth settled in. They had not been chosen because they embodied ancient honor. They had been chosen because they could be used up. By the final months of the war, the battalion existed more on paper than in reality. Units were merged, names changed, records became inconsistent, loss reports were vague, and when Japan's surrender finally came, there was no place for them in the story that followed. No parade, no acknowledgement, just silence. Because honoring the battalion would have meant confronting what it truly represented. Not a revival of the samurai spirit, but the moment it was completely consumed. And that was something post-war Japan was not ready to face. When the war ended, the battalion did not surrender as a unit. It simply disappeared. Japan's capitulation in August 1945 was sudden, absolute and humiliating for a nation that had been told for years that surrender was unthinkable. Orders came down fast. Cease fire, disarm, comply. Units across the empire laid down their weapons and waited for occupation forces to arrive. But for the samurai battalion, there were no clear instructions. By then, it barely existed in any official sense. Its original structure had been shattered by casualties and reorganizations. Surviving soldiers were scattered across depleted units or isolated garrisons. Some burned their swords themselves. Others were ordered to hand them over quietly, without record. No ceremony marked the end. No one came to collect their story. In the weeks that followed, Japan began rewriting itself. The occupying authorities moved quickly to dismantle the symbols of militarism that had driven the war. Bushido, once promoted as a national virtue, was now seen as a dangerous ideology. Textbooks were revised. Military traditions were purged. Anything that suggested glorification of sacrifice or death was treated with suspicion. In that environment, the samurai battalion became inconvenient. It did not fit the narrative Japan needed to survive the post-war world. A modern nation could not easily explain why it had resurrected medieval combat ideals and fused them with industrial warfare. A defeated nation could not afford to celebrate a unit built on expendability. So the records thinned. Training documents were destroyed or reclassified. Unit names were changed. After-action reports were filed under generic headings. Survivors were discouraged from speaking, sometimes formally, sometimes through unspoken pressure. Most complied. They returned to civilian life, carrying memories they had no language for. In public, they were expected to rebuild, to forget, to move forward. In private, many struggled with what they had been trained to become, and how easily they had been discarded. For decades, the battalion existed only as rumor, scattered mentions in veterans' accounts, conflicting reports in Allied intelligence files, photographs that raised more questions than answers, men in standard uniforms holding swords that didn't belong to regulation issue. Historians who pursued the trail found it frustratingly incomplete. Names didn't line up. Dates contradicted each other. Entire months appeared to vanish from official records. It was as if the battalion had been deliberately blurred out of history rather than erased outright. And in a way, it had. Post-war Japan wanted distance from the war's darkest excesses. The samurai battalion represented an uncomfortable truth. That tradition had not simply been remembered, it had been weaponized. Honor had been stripped of choice. Death had been turned into policy. Eventually, fragments surfaced, private diaries, training manuals mislabeled and forgotten, interviews conducted late in life when silence no longer felt necessary. Together, they painted a picture far more complex than myth. The battalion was neither heroic legend nor simple madness. It was a product of desperation. A moment when an empire, cornered by modern war, reached backward for answers and found only more suffering. The swords did not restore balance. They did not change the war's outcome. They only revealed how far Japan was willing to go to delay the inevitable. Today, the battalion remains largely unknown, not because it wasn't real, but because remembering it requires confronting a painful distortion of history. It forces a question without a comforting answer. What happens when tradition is no longer a guide, but a weapon? The Samurai Battalion of World War II was not a return to the past. It was the final breaking point between honor and survival, and that is why, for so long, it was easier to let it fade into silence.